Stacy Feldman was 44 years old, and to everyone who knew her, family was everything. She was the youngest of three sisters.
My baby sister. She's 4 years younger than I am.
The baby of the family, the one who always believed life would eventually give her what she dreamed of most: a husband, children, a home filled with warmth.
A huge heart you could just see before you even knew her.
The joy of Stacy, and what really made Stacy who she is also, is she had all these different friends.
By March of 2015, it looked like she had it all. A beautiful house in Denver, Colorado, 2 young children, a husband named Robert Feldman. From the outside, the picture was perfect. The kind of life people admire from a distance and assume is happy. Stacy was deeply involved in her community. She volunteered, she led, she gave her time to others. At her children's elementary school, she served as president of the parent-teacher organization. She also worked for a nonprofit dedicated to funding research into liver disease. People who knew her described the same thing again and again. She radiated joy. She loved pink. She loved celebrations. She was the kind of person who made a room feel lighter just by walking into it. But long before the house in Denver, before the children, before the marriage, there were years of waiting. As Stacy entered her 30s, she watched her friends build the lives she wanted for herself. They got married, they had children, and she remained single. For someone who had always dreamed of becoming a wife and a mother, time began to feel like an enemy. Then she met Robert Feldman. Friends knew him as Bob. He was charismatic, confident, 14 years older than Stacy. To her, he seemed like stability, like certainty, like the future finally arriving. They married in 2005 in Montreal at the Ritz. It was everything Stacy had imagined. She wore a tiara because in her mind, this was her fairy tale. Soon after, they settled in the suburbs of Denver. A daughter was born, then a son. From the outside, the Feldmans looked like a family that had won. But illusions don't shatter all at once. They crack quietly. Bob struggled professionally. He was a salesman who never quite delivered, never quite earned enough. Stacy had once dreamed of staying home with her children. Instead, she worked to help keep the household afloat, and slowly, the balance of power shifted. The house was in Bob's name. The credit cards were in Bob's name. The money was in Bob's control. Stacy became financially vulnerable inside her own marriage. Those close to her began to notice changes, control, threats. Bob warned her that if she ever tried to leave, he could take the children and leave her with nothing. It wasn't loud violence. It was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. By 2015, the marriage no longer felt like a fairy tale. It felt like a performance. Behind closed doors, the distance between Stacy and Bob had grown impossible to ignore. They argued, often, about money, about control, about the future. Stacy felt trapped inside a life she had waited decades to build. And then, something changed. In early March, Stacy received an anonymous email. It was short, direct, and devastating. It claimed that Bob was having an affair. At first, she didn't want to believe it, but doubt, once planted, doesn't need much to grow. She began to look closer, at his phone, at his schedule, at the unexplained absences. The picture that emerged was impossible to deny. Bob had been using dating apps, meeting other women, living a second life. For Stacy, it wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Years of loyalty, years of sacrifice, years of holding the family together. And suddenly, the truth was staring back at her from a screen. She confided in her sisters, she told close friends, and for the first time in her life, Stacy began to speak openly about leaving. She talked about divorce, about starting over, about protecting her children. But leaving was never going to be simple. Bob controlled the money, the house, the accounts, and he made sure she understood that. According to those closest to her, Bob told Stacy that if she tried to leave, she would lose everything. The house, the lifestyle, and possibly the children. Fear replaced hope. Still, Stacy didn't stay silent. On the morning of March 9th, 2015, she confronted Bob. What exactly was said between them is known only to two people. But by the end of that conversation, Stacy was done pretending. She sent messages to friends. She told her sister she was ready to move on. She told people close to her that she was finished. For the first time in years, she sounded resolved, determined, and that made her dangerous. March 1st, 2015 started like any other Sunday morning in the Feldman household. Bob dropped the children off at Temple Sinai for religious school around 8:30 a.m. The plan was for Stacy to pick them up at noon and take them to a Purim carnival. But noon came and went. Stacy was nowhere to be seen. The school called her phone. No answer. Then they called Bob. He said he would be there shortly. When 12:45 p.m. arrived, he still hadn't shown. His story changed. Now he claimed a family friend would pick up the children. Finally, at 1:05 p.m., Bob arrived at the synagogue. His demeanor was off, disheveled, abrupt. Instead of going home, Bob took the children to the Purim carnival and then to a bicycle shop. It wasn't until 3 p.m. that they returned. Then came the call to 911. Bob claimed he had found Stacy unconscious in the shower, water running. He pulled her out, attempted CPR, but the first responders noticed something strange immediately. There was no water on the bathroom floor, not a drop, and on the recording of the 911 call, there were no sounds consistent with chest compressions or rescue breathing, only a toilet flushing, objects being knocked over, a sense of staged chaos. Paramedics arrived at 3:40 p.m. Stacy was pronounced dead at the scene. Detective Randy Dennison, one of the first on site, noted something about Bob's behavior. It wasn't shock, it wasn't panic, it was performance. Bob walked, talked, reacted, all like an actor on a stage. And though the initial ruling suggested a bathroom accident, those closest to Stacy knew something was wrong. In February 2015, Bob Feldman was active on Tinder. He used the name Robert Wolf. He matched with a woman named Susan McBride, a stranger unaware she was about to step into a nightmare. Bob began lying immediately. He told Susan he was divorced. He told her his wife was absent, uninterested in the children. He painted a picture of a man wronged, lonely, and waiting for someone to rescue him. Susan's first date with Bob seemed normal, easy, friendly. But when she tried to look him up online, using the names he gave her, nothing matched, nothing at all. Suspicion grew. Susan tried to break it off, but Bob convinced her to give him another chance. He claimed he had been stalked. He claimed he was separated from his wife. Against her instincts, Susan trusted him. On February 26, 2015, just 4 days before Stacy's death, Bob went to Susan's house. They spent hours talking. They had sex. And yet, immediately after, red flags appeared. He canceled their plans for the following weekend. He pulled away. Susan's gut told her something was very wrong. She started digging deeper. She found Stacy online, the PTO president at Southmore Elementary School, Bob's wife, mother of his 2 children. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Bob was lying. He was married. He had children. He was cheating. Susan faced a choice: walk away or tell Stacy the truth. She chose honesty. On the morning of March 1st, 2015, at 6:20 a.m., Susan sent an email to Stacy. She wrote clearly, compassionately, "I met your husband on Tinder. He told me you were separated. If you're not, you should know he is cheating on you." Susan attached screenshots of their messages, evidence, proof. This was the chain that would set everything in motion, the first domino falling in a deadly sequence. The morning of March 1st, 2015 was ordinary until it wasn't. At 6:20 a.m., Stacy received Susan's email. The words hit her like a hammer. Bob had been lying. He was married. He was cheating. Stacy felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Years of trust, years of dreams, shattered in an instant. She called Susan. Her voice was calm, controlled. 5 minutes of conversation. No hysteria, no screams, just clarity. "I'm done with him," she said. That sentence, 4 simple words, would become the key to understanding what happened later that day. She went about her morning, prepared for the children. The plan: pick them up from Temple Sinai and take them to the Purim Carnival. But the day would never unfold as planned. When Bob picked up the children, the house waited silently. No laughter, no greetings, just shadows. Hours later, the call came. Bob claimed he had found Stacy in the shower, unconscious, water running. He tried CPR, but first responders noticed the inconsistencies immediately. No water on the floor, no sounds of rescue on the call, only objects knocked over, staged chaos. By 3:40 p.m., Stacy was pronounced dead. The perfect life was gone. Detective Randy Dennison was among the first to arrive at the Feldman home. Even from the driveway, something about Bob seemed off. Not grief, not panic, performance. Paramedics checked Stacy, pronounced her dead at 3:40 p.m. But the story Bob told didn't add up. He claimed he had pulled her from a running shower, but the floor was dry, not a drop of water anywhere. And the 911 call, no sounds of chest compressions, no rescue breathing, just objects knocked over, a staged sense of chaos. Detective Dennison noted Bob's behavior. Confused? Maybe. Shocked? Perhaps. But something theatrical lingered. Neighbors mentioned hearing nothing unusual, no struggle, no cries. Yet Stacy had died. The autopsy would soon reveal the truth, or at least hint at it. Dr. Kelly Kobolansky performed it the next day, March 2nd. 80 separate injuries, bruises, abrasions, hemorrhages. Special signs in her eyes, small burst blood vessels, classic indicators of strangulation or suffocation. The cause of death? Officially, undetermined. The perfect crime? Almost. But those who loved Stacy, they felt the truth in their bones. From the moment Susan Ullman learned of her sister's death, she didn't accept the official story. Her instinct told her something was wrong. Bob had lied. He had a history of manipulation. And Stacy deserved justice. Susan recalled, "My immediate reaction was that her husband had killed her." She started gathering evidence, talking to friends, family, neighbors, piecing together Bob's lies, his financial control, his infidelity. She discovered that Bob had profiles on dating apps under fake names: Robert Wolf, Mike Reed. He was a chronic manipulator, always scheming, always deceiving. But Susan knew that suspicions alone wouldn't bring him to justice. She needed expertise. She needed allies. Nearly 2 years after Stacy's death, a psychologist relative suggested contacting an institute specializing in strangulation prevention. They connected Susan with Detective Randy Dennison, who had long harbored doubts about the case. And then Dr. Bill Smoke entered, a forensic expert in domestic violence strangulation cases. Dr. Smoke meticulously reviewed the autopsy, photographs, and evidence from the scene. He saw what others had missed: over 80 injuries, defensive wounds, signs of prolonged violent assault. The picture became horrifyingly clear. Stacy had not slipped. She had not drowned accidentally. She had been attacked, strangled, suffocated, and staged to look like a bathroom accident. The sisterhood had begun its work. Susan's persistence, courage, and determination became the spark that would ignite justice. April 2022, nearly 7 years after Stacy Feldman's death. Robert Feldman finally faced a jury. The courtroom was tense, shadows of the past looming large. 9 days of trial, public attention fixed on every word. Dr. Bill Smoke was the star witness. Using a mannequin, he demonstrated how Bob had attacked Stacy, straddled her, knees pinning her arms, strangling, suffocating. Prosecutor Maggie Convoy told the jury, "Stacy Feldman can't tell you what happened that day, but her body can." Susan McBride flew in from Italy. She testified about the phone call that morning, the chain of events that led to Stacy's death. The Feldman's daughter, now 16, described that morning as completely normal. "I remember walking downstairs, having breakfast with my family. Nothing seemed unusual." The defense tried to discredit Dr. Smoke, called him a hired gun, called him a narcissist, claimed 3 pathologists maintained the death was undetermined. Bob sat quietly, showing little emotion, occasionally laughing with his lawyers as the horrific testimony unfolded. After 9 days, the jury deliberated. Less than 3 hours later, the verdict was in. Guilty of first-degree murder. Stacy Feldman's mother, Dorothy, addressed the courtroom. "If you really loved your children, you wouldn't have killed their mother. This is all because you couldn't keep your pants zipped." Susan Ullman said, "I have been fighting for this for 7 years because my sister deserves to rest in peace. He has taken 7 years from my life, and he's not taking one more second." Bob simply replied, "No. No apology. No explanation." Justice had been served. With the verdict delivered, the weight of 7 years of uncertainty finally lifted. Susan Ullman had fought tirelessly for her sister. Her courage, persistence, and refusal to accept the official story had brought a killer to justice. Stacy Feldman would finally rest in peace. Robert Feldman began a series of appeals, but the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of abuse, the staged crime scene, the autopsy findings, nothing could erase the truth. The family mourned, but they also celebrated justice. Stacy's mother, Dorothy, found some comfort knowing that her daughter's life and death mattered. Susan became an advocate for domestic violence awareness. She worked with the Alliance for Hope International to educate and protect others from similar fates. The story of Stacy Feldman became more than a tragedy. It became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of love and sisterhood. In the end, evil had been confronted. A sister's determination had prevailed, and Stacy's memory would inspire change, ensuring that others might not suffer as she did. Her life, though cut tragically short, left a lasting mark. A story of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately, justice. If you're into cases like this, stay with me. It only gets darker. On September 23, 2019, 2 children were reported missing in Rexburg, Idaho. 17-year-old Ty Lee Ryan, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow. At first, it didn't feel like a national story. It felt like a custody issue, a family dispute, another complicated divorce case in suburban America. But within weeks, investigators would realize something chilling. Their mother, Lori Vallow, was smiling, vacationing, getting married, and their children were nowhere to be found. This is not just a missing persons case. This is a story about belief systems, manipulation, control, and how ideology can become more powerful than instinct. Because Lori Vallow did not see herself as a criminal, she believed she was chosen, and that belief changed everything. Lori Vallow had once been described as charismatic, devoted, energetic. Born in 1973, she grew up in a seemingly normal family. Friends described her as confident and socially magnetic. She married multiple times throughout her life, 5 husbands in total. But her life began shifting dramatically after she met Chad Daybell. Chad wasn't a celebrity preacher. He wasn't a nationally known prophet. He was a fringe religious author from Idaho who wrote self-published apocalyptic novels. His books blended Mormon theology with end-of-times fiction. He claimed to receive visions. He claimed to see beyond the veil. He claimed some people were light and some were dark. When Lori met Chad in 2018 at a religious conference, witnesses would later say something felt immediate between them. Chad allegedly told Lori she had lived multiple past lives, that she was a translated being, that she was chosen for a divine mission before the second coming. To someone already drifting toward extreme religious thinking, that kind of affirmation can feel intoxicating. By 2019, Lori had fully embraced Chad's worldview. And in that worldview, some people weren't just flawed, they were zombies. According to testimony later revealed in court, Chad and Lori developed a belief system in which certain individuals were possessed by dark spirits. When someone became a zombie, it meant their original soul had left and been replaced by an evil entity. And in their minds, that justified drastic action. Among those labeled dark, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, her children, Ty Lee and JJ, and eventually, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell. But before the world would understand that ideology, there was violence. On July 11, 2019, Charles Vallow was shot and killed in Arizona. The shooter? Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Alex claimed self-defense. He said Charles had attacked him with a baseball bat. Police initially treated it as a domestic dispute gone wrong. Lori's behavior that day was unsettling. Body cam footage showed her calm, smiling, joking with officers. Hours after her husband's death, she took JJ to Burger King. No visible panic, no visible grief. But Charles had told friends before his death that Lori believed he was no longer himself, that she thought he had been replaced by a dark spirit. To her, this wasn't murder, it was spiritual warfare. And that belief would soon expand to include her own children. By September 2019, Lori had moved to Rexburg, Idaho. Ty Lee was last seen on September 8th during a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. JJ was last seen alive on September 22nd. After that, silence. When police conducted a welfare check in November 2019, Lori lied. She said JJ was staying with a friend in Arizona. That wasn't true. Within days, Lori and Chad fled to Hawaii. While authorities searched for 2 missing children, Lori was on a beach, smiling in wedding photos. Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, had died suddenly in October 2019, initially ruled natural causes. 2 weeks later, Lori and Chad were married. 2 dead spouses, 2 missing children, and a couple who appeared untouched by it all. This was no longer a custody dispute. This was something much darker. And the question investigators began asking was simple. Where are the children? By late 2019, investigators weren't just looking at a missing persons case, they were trying to understand a belief system. Because nothing about Lori Vallow's behavior made sense in a traditional framework of crime. She wasn't hiding in fear, she wasn't avoiding cameras, she wasn't acting like a mother whose children had vanished. She appeared certain that she was protected, certain that she was justified, certain that what was happening around her was part of something divine, and that certainty led straight to Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell had spent years building a small but devoted following. Through podcasts, religious prepper events, and self-published novels, he positioned himself as someone who could interpret spiritual energy. He claimed he could rank people as light or dark. He claimed he could determine if someone's spirit had left their body. He claimed he knew who would survive the coming apocalypse. To most people, those claims would sound extreme, but within certain fringe religious communities, especially prepper circles anticipating the end times, they didn't sound completely absurd. And that's where Lori stepped in. Unlike Chad, Lori had charisma. She was socially magnetic, confident, persuasive, attractive. Witnesses later testified that she spoke openly about the end of the world, that she believed July 2020 would mark catastrophic global events, that only the chosen would survive. And in private conversations, something darker was forming. According to court documents and testimony, Chad began assigning dark ratings to people in Lori's life. Charles Vallow, dark. Tylee Ryan, dark. JJ Vallow, dark. When someone crossed a certain threshold on their scale, they were considered a zombie. And once labeled a zombie, the person was no longer seen as themselves. They were seen as a vessel, a body without a soul, an obstacle to God's plan. It's difficult to comprehend how a mother could accept that framework about her own children. But belief systems don't shift overnight. They erode reality slowly. First, through reinforcement, then isolation, then repetition. Lori and Chad reportedly spent hours discussing past lives, spiritual missions, and apocalyptic timelines. Friends noticed Lori becoming distant, more intense, less grounded. At one point, she allegedly told people that she no longer needed to worry about her children because their real spirits were already gone. Meanwhile, another figure stood quietly in the background, Alex Cox, Lori's older brother. Alex had already killed once, shooting Charles Vallow in July 2019, but investigators would later question whether that was an isolated act or part of something coordinated. Phone records would eventually reveal that Alex's phone pinged near Chad Daybell's property multiple times in September 2019, around the dates Tylee and JJ were last seen. At the time, no one knew that, but the pattern was forming. And then something else happened. On October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, died suddenly in her sleep. Chad told people she had a cough, that she wasn't feeling well, that it was natural. An autopsy was not immediately performed. 2 weeks later, Chad married Lori in Hawaii. No visible grief, no hesitation, just urgency. It was as if obstacles were being removed. By November 2019, law enforcement in Idaho and Arizona began comparing notes. 2 dead spouses, 2 missing children, 1 brother who had pulled the trigger once already, and a couple who seemed spiritually detached from the chaos. When police conducted a welfare check for JJ on November 26, 2019, Lori claimed he was staying with a friend named Melanie Gibb. Police contacted Melanie. She said JJ was not with her. Within 24 hours, Lori and Chad had left Idaho. They flew to Hawaii, and while investigators scrambled to locate 2 children, Lori was photographed smiling on a beach, dancing, laughing, holding hands with Chad. The public reaction was swift. How could a mother behave this way? But inside Lori's mind, the narrative was different. This wasn't abandonment. This wasn't murder. This was preparation for the end of the world. And in her belief system, removing dark spirits wasn't cruelty, it was obedience. The problem with apocalyptic thinking is that it creates urgency. When you believe the world is ending, consequences feel temporary. When you believe you're chosen, accountability feels irrelevant. And when you believe someone no longer has a soul, harm becomes easier to rationalize. By December 2019, national media had picked up the story. The names Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were now known across the country. Search parties formed. Neighbors spoke out. Former friends began sharing concerns. And investigators started asking a terrifying question. What if the children were never meant to be found alive?
Before the country knew their names, there were 2 ordinary days. September 8th, 2019, September 23rd, 2019. 2 dates that would later become the center of everything. On September 8th, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, Alex Cox, JJ, and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan visited Yellowstone National Park. There is a photo from that day. In it, Tylee stands near the edge of a rocky area. She looks distant, guarded, almost tired. Investigators would later confirm that this was the last known image of her alive. After that trip, Tylee was never seen again. No school attendance, no social media activity, no contact with friends. When people later asked Lori where Tylee was, she gave different answers. Sometimes she said Tylee was attending college in Idaho. Other times she claimed she was staying with friends. There was no enrollment, no documentation, no proof. Phone data would later show something chilling. On September 9th, the day after the Yellowstone trip, Alex Cox's phone pinged near Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg, Idaho. That same day, neighbors reported seeing a large bonfire on Chad's land. At the time, no one connected it to a missing 16-year-old girl. But investigators would later dig in that exact area, and what they found would change everything. JJ was last seen on September 23, 2019. He had been enrolled in a special needs program at his school in Rexburg. Teachers described him as energetic, structured, dependent on routine. After September 23rd, Lori told the school JJ would be homeschooled. He never returned. The last confirmed sighting came from a friend who said JJ appeared withdrawn and unusually quiet. Again, phone records would later show Alex Cox's device near Chad's property the morning of September 23rd. This time, the data placed him in a specific area of the yard, an area that would later become a crime scene. By November 2019, extended family members grew alarmed. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, hadn't spoken to him in weeks. That was unusual. JJ relied on regular communication. Routine mattered to him. When they pushed Lori for answers, she deflected. First, she said JJ was safe. Then she said he was with a friend. Then she refused to cooperate. On November 26th, police conducted a welfare check. Lori claimed JJ was in Arizona with Melanie Gibb. Police called Melanie. JJ was not there. The lie collapsed instantly. Within 24 hours, Lori and Chad were gone. They had flown to Hawaii. As winter set in across Idaho, law enforcement escalated. Missing persons posters circulated nationally. Media outlets picked up the case. Public pressure mounted. Search warrants were executed, phone records subpoenaed, digital trails analyzed, and slowly the timeline sharpened. Tylee, last seen September 8th. JJ, last seen September 23rd. Both dates closely aligned with Alex Cox's presence near Chad's property. Then, in December 2019, another shock. Alex Cox, the brother, the enforcer, the man whose phone data kept appearing near critical locations, died suddenly in Arizona. Official cause: pulmonary embolism. No trial, no testimony, no cross-examination. The one man who could have answered direct questions was gone. And that raised another question. Was Alex the architect or just the instrument? June 9th, 2020, the excavation. After months of investigation, law enforcement returned to Chad Daybell's property with a warrant. They brought forensic teams, cadaver dogs, excavation equipment. News helicopters circled overhead. It didn't take long. First, they discovered human remains buried in a pet cemetery area. Then, a second site. Tylee's remains were found burned and dismembered. JJ's body was discovered wrapped in plastic and duct tape. The confirmation ended months of speculation. The children were never missing. They were buried in the backyard of the man who claimed to speak for God. Chad Daybell was arrested that same day. Lori Vallow, still in Hawaii, was already in custody on child abandonment charges. Now the case shifted. This was no longer about missing children. This was about murder, premeditation, conspiracy, and a belief system that had crossed into irreversible harm. The country had watched a smiling woman on a beach while search teams combed frozen ground. Now they understood why. And the next phase would move from fields and phone records into a courtroom.
By the time the trial began, the story had already gripped the nation. 2 missing children, a prophetic author, a mother who smiled in Hawaii while investigators searched frozen soil. But in court, the narrative would be stripped of speculation. What remained were timelines, messages, phone pings, and bodies. Lori Vallow Daybell was charged with first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan, first-degree murder of JJ Vallow, conspiracy to commit murder, grand theft related to Social Security benefits collected after the children's deaths. Chad Daybell faced similar charges, along with conspiracy related to the death of his first wife, Tammy Daybell. This wasn't just about belief. It was about intent. And prosecutors were determined to show that these deaths were not spontaneous acts, but coordinated decisions. The prosecution built their case on structure. They presented digital evidence that painted a chilling timeline. Text messages between Chad and Lori discussing light and dark ratings. Conversations referring to people as zombies. Messages sent shortly after the children were last seen. One message from Chad to Lori stood out. The day after Tylee disappeared, Chad texted Tammy describing shooting a raccoon and burning debris in the backyard. Investigators argued this message was not casual, it was a cover story, because that was the same day Alex Cox's phone placed him near the property, in the same area where Tylee's remains were later found. The jury saw maps, cell phone data charts, photographs from the excavation. Forensic experts testified about how JJ's body was wrapped in plastic and duct tape. This wasn't panic. This wasn't confusion. This required steps, deliberate steps. Prosecutors also introduced financial evidence. After Charles Vallow's death, Lori attempted to access his life insurance policy. She believed she was the beneficiary, but Charles had quietly changed it to his sister, Kay Woodcock. The payout, nearly $1 million, never went to Lori.
After the children were killed, Lori continued collecting their Social Security benefits, month after month, while telling others they were safe. Money alone may not explain everything, but it showed practicality. Cold practicality. Lori's defense did not deny the children were dead. Instead, they attempted to separate her from the physical acts. They suggested that Alex Cox was the one who carried out the killings, that Lori was influenced, that her religious beliefs were extreme but not criminal. They argued she was manipulated by Chad, that she was emotionally and spiritually consumed. But the prosecution countered. You don't collect benefits for children you believe are alive. You don't lie repeatedly to police if you think nothing is wrong. You don't flee to Hawaii if you expect your children to reappear. Belief does not erase action. And the jury had to decide whether Lori was a follower or a participant. In May 2023, the jury delivered its decision. Guilty on all major counts related to the murders of Tylee and JJ. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of theft. Lori Vallow Daybell was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. But the story wasn't over, because Chad Daybell still faced his own trial, and the question remained, who led whom? Was Lori the believer, or was she the engine? The trial forced the country to confront something deeper. How far can belief go before it becomes violence? When does faith become justification? And how many warning signs were missed before 2 children disappeared into a backyard grave? When Lori Vallow Daybell was sentenced to life in prison, many believed the story had finally reached its conclusion. But it hadn't, because another trial was still coming. And this one would answer a different question. Was Chad Daybell simply a fringe author who believed his own mythology? Or was he the architect? Chad Daybell's trial began in 2024. Unlike Lori's case, this proceeding included the death of Tammy Daybell, his wife of nearly 3 decades. Tammy had originally been believed to have died of natural causes in October 2019, but after the children's remains were discovered, her body was exhumed. A second autopsy revealed something far more disturbing. Tammy's death was ruled a homicide. Prosecutors argued she had been suffocated. Now the pattern looked even clearer. Charles Vallow, shot. Tylee Ryan, killed and burned. JJ Vallow, murdered and buried. Tammy Daybell, dead weeks before Chad married Lori. 4 deaths, one tightly connected circle. In Lori's trial, the defense suggested she was influenced. In Chad's trial, prosecutors flipped the narrative. They presented Chad as the ideological leader, the man who created the light and dark rating system, the man who predicted Tammy's death in advance, the man whose property concealed the bodies. Text messages showed Chad speaking in prophetic tones. He told Lori they had been married in past lives, that they were chosen, that their union had eternal purpose. It wasn't just romance, it was destiny, in his words. Prosecutors argued this belief system was weaponized. It allowed Chad to remove obstacles, spiritually and physically, while maintaining moral distance. And unlike Lori's emotional volatility, Chad often appeared calm, measured, detached, which made the evidence feel even colder. In 2024, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty, on multiple counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy. But this time, the sentence was different. Chad Daybell was sentenced to death. The courtroom once again fell silent. 2 people who claimed divine authority, 2 people who spoke of chosen missions, now separated by prison walls and legal finality. But the case never truly belonged to Lori or Chad. It belonged to the children. To Tylee Ryan, intelligent, independent, protective of her younger brother. To JJ Vallow, energetic, vulnerable, deeply loved by his grandparents. It belonged to Tammy Daybell, a school librarian, mother, and longtime spouse, and to Charles Vallow, who had warned authorities that something was deeply wrong. There were warning signs. Charles had told police Lori believed he was possessed. Friends had noticed escalating apocalyptic language. Family members sensed isolation. But belief systems wrapped in religion are difficult to confront, especially when no crime has yet been proven. By the time law enforcement connected the dots, the damage was irreversible. This case wasn't just about murder. It was about the psychological power of apocalyptic thinking, how small ideological circles can reinforce delusion, the danger of charismatic authority without accountability, and how belief can slowly detach someone from reality. Lori and Chad did not wake up one morning as murderers. The transformation was gradual, layer by layer, idea by idea, justification by justification, until the unthinkable became acceptable. And maybe that is the most unsettling part, because this story didn't begin with violence. It began with belief.
And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment.
Katie Feldman was 22 years old when she disappeared. It was October 24th, 2016, the last day she was seen alive. She wasn't a runaway. She wasn't hiding from anyone. She wasn't trying to start a new life or make a point. By every account, Katie lived a predictable routine. Work, home, family, familiar roads. She answered calls. She showed up when expected. When plans changed, she said so. That's why the silence mattered. The last confirmed day Katie was seen followed no dramatic script, no arguments witnessed, no threats reported in advance. She left, intending to return, and never did. When hours passed without a response, concern turned into alarm. By nightfall, her absence could no longer be explained away. Law enforcement initially treated it as a missing adult case, cautious, procedural, restrained. At 22, Katie was legally free to go where she pleased, but freedom alone doesn't erase patterns, and patterns were already breaking. Her phone went quiet. Her car was missing. Her social media activity stopped abruptly mid-rhythm, as if someone had cut a wire instead of letting it fade out. Within the first 24 hours, by October 25, 2016, investigators began reconstructing her final movements, not through emotion, but through logistics, cell phone pings, traffic cameras, financial activity, who she had spoken to, where she was supposed to be, who expected her, and who didn't. That's when the focus narrowed. Katie was married to John Blauvelt, a former U.S. Army sergeant. Their relationship, outwardly ordinary, carried quiet fractures beneath the surface. Those fractures weren't yet visible to police, but they would be. And once exposed, they would change the direction of the entire investigation. John reported Katie missing on October 24, 2016, later in the evening. On paper, his actions looked cooperative. He answered questions, he provided timelines, he expressed concern. But concern is easy to perform. Consistency is harder. Investigators noticed early that John's account relied heavily on assumptions rather than confirmations. He spoke about where Katie might have gone, what she could have done, and why she probably didn't answer. It wasn't incriminating, not yet, but it was imprecise. Precision matters in missing persons cases. While John remained at the center of the known timeline, another figure hovered just outside the frame. Hannah Thompson, 17 years old at the time, living in the same house. No blood relation to Katie, no formal role in her marriage, but present, always present. Hannah's presence wasn't flagged immediately. She was young, quiet, peripheral, someone law enforcement often overlooks early, especially when there's no direct allegation tying them to wrongdoing. But proximity has a way of becoming relevant over time. As the search expanded over the following days, the tone shifted. Katie's car was found abandoned on October 26, 2016, miles away from where it should have been. There were no signs of a struggle inside, no blood, no forced entry. The scene suggested compliance or trust. That detail changed everything. When people vanish violently, there is often chaos left behind. Scratches, broken objects, witnesses who heard shouting. This case had none of that, which meant whatever happened to Katie likely began calmly, with conversation, with familiarity. Investigators now faced a harder question than where did she go? They had to ask, who did she willingly go with? As hours turned into days, pressure mounted. Media attention followed. Tips came in, some useful, most not. Every new lead was logged, checked, eliminated, or folded back into the growing timeline. Then came the discovery. Katie's body was found on the morning of October 27, 2016, in the basement of an abandoned house. She had not died where she was discovered. Forensic evidence indicated her body had been moved after death. That single fact reframed the entire case from disappearance to homicide. The manner of death was brutal, but controlled. Not impulsive, not random. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was deliberate. Someone had taken Katie to a secluded location. Someone had killed her. Someone had transported her body, and someone believed they had enough time to do all of it without being seen. At that moment, the investigation stopped being about where Katie went and became about who planned her end. John Blauvelt was no longer just a concerned husband. He was now the center of gravity, and the clock was already ticking.
The investigation didn't explode forward. It tightened. Once Katie Feldman's death was confirmed as homicide on October 27, 2016, detectives stopped casting a wide net and began pulling specific threads, slowly, deliberately, knowing that one wrong move could snap the case in half. John Blauvelt remained free. That fact alone created tension. When the husband of a murdered woman is not immediately arrested, it usually means one of two things. Either there isn't enough evidence yet, or the truth is worse than it looks on the surface. Investigators began dissecting John's life the way you strip a machine for faulty parts: marriage, finances, digital footprint, behavior. And with each layer removed, the picture grew darker. The marriage was not stable. Behind closed doors, the relationship between John and Katie had been deteriorating for months. Friends and family described emotional distance, arguments, and a growing sense that John was no longer invested in the life he shared with his wife. There was no public violence, no official reports, just erosion, the kind that goes unnoticed until something collapses. And then there was Hannah Thompson, 17 years old at the time, living in the home under the same roof as a married couple. Officially, she was just a roommate. Unofficially, her role was far more complicated. Investigators learned that John and Hannah's relationship went beyond boundaries that should never have been crossed. Messages, behavior, and later testimony would reveal a connection that was emotional, obsessive, and increasingly exclusive. Katie was no longer at the center of John's world. As interviews continued in early November 2016, inconsistencies in John's timeline began to surface. Small at first, the kind that could be explained by stress or memory. But they didn't disappear, they stacked. Times didn't align, movements contradicted digital data, statements shifted subtly between interviews. None of it was enough to arrest him, but it was enough to keep him close. Meanwhile, Hannah drew attention in a different way. At Katie's funeral, observers noticed behavior that didn't fit grief. She lingered longer than expected. She appeared tense, distracted. Surveillance footage from the funeral home captured moments that investigators later reviewed frame by frame.
whispered exchanges, nervous gestures, and awareness of cameras that felt out of place. It wasn't evidence of guilt, but it was evidence of fear. Detectives brought Hannah in for questioning. At first, she positioned herself as peripheral, a bystander caught in tragedy. She claimed distance from Katie, minimal involvement, limited knowledge. But pressure exposes fractures. As questioning continued, her composure cracked, her answers became inconsistent, her body language shifted. She avoided direct statements when timelines narrowed. When confronted with facts she couldn't explain away, she retreated into uncertainty. Detectives didn't accuse her outright. They didn't have to. What they needed was leverage. At the same time, a seemingly insignificant detail resurfaced from earlier interviews: trash bags. One of the roommates had mentioned seeing John and Hannah carrying multiple bags of trash out to a vehicle on the night Katie disappeared. At the time, it meant nothing. People take out trash every day. But now, with the body found and the timeline tightening, it meant everything. When Hannah denied remembering such an event and John later acknowledged it had happened, a silent contradiction locked into place. Someone was lying, and liars rarely lie alone. Detectives shifted focus again, not to confront, but to observe. They allowed John to believe he was still ahead, that he had room to maneuver, that the story he was telling might hold. In reality, they were mapping pressure points. Cell phone records placed John in areas he couldn't explain. Phone pings aligned with locations tied to the crime scene, not with his stated movements. He offered explanations, technical errors, coincidences, misunderstandings, but coincidences don't stack forever. Then a new name entered the case: Charles Scott, a former Army associate of John's, someone from his past who hadn't been mentioned until now. Someone whose phone records placed him in the same geographic area as John on the night Katie died. This wasn't coincidence, it was convergence. Detectives didn't need to know exactly what Charles's role was yet. What mattered was that John brought another variable into a case already collapsing under its own weight. And from that moment on, the investigation stopped being about whether John was involved. It became about how many people he pulled into it and how far they were willing to protect him.
After October 2016, the case did not end. It went quiet. Katie Feldman was dead, but no arrests followed. Not immediately. What investigators had was suspicion, fragments, and a timeline that refused to fully lock into place. The evidence pointed inward, towards John Blauvelt, but it was not yet enough to move forward decisively. So the case entered its longest phase. For years, John remained free. Not because he was cleared, but because the case wasn't finished. Outwardly, life continued. John stayed in the area. He worked. He spoke to investigators when required. He complied just enough to appear cooperative. There was no dramatic escape, no sudden disappearance. From 2016 through the early 2020s, he lived in the open, under observation, but not under arrest. Investigators never let the case go cold. They re-examined digital data. They revisited interviews. They waited for technology, witnesses, or pressure to shift the balance. And slowly, it did. As years passed, new digital tools allowed investigators to extract more from old data: phone records, location histories, deleted communications. Patterns that once looked incomplete began to sharpen. Movements aligned, timelines tightened, associations became clearer. One of those associations was Charles Scott. A former Army associate of John's, Charles had been present on the night Katie disappeared. Early on, his role was unclear, peripheral, unexplained, unresolved. But revisited data showed repeated contact, proximity, and coordination that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. At the same time, Hannah Thompson's role became clearer. She had not acted alone. She had not acted randomly.
She had acted in alignment. What once appeared as passive behavior, helping clean, moving items, staying silent, now read as participation after the fact. Not the act itself, but the protection of it. By 2022, the investigation reached critical mass. Reconstructed timelines placed John in locations he denied being. Digital traces contradicted years-old statements. Witness recollections, once vague, now aligned with data. The case was no longer missing pieces, it was assembling them. And John noticed. In late 2022, investigators prepared to move forward. Interviews intensified. Legal pressure increased. John's behavior changed. He became guarded, withdrawn, calculated. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. About procedure, about timelines, about consequences. Then, before an arrest could be made, John made his move. He ran. In November 2022, John Blauvelt disappeared. Not suddenly, deliberately. He left his known life behind: employment, housing, routine. He did not notify authorities. He did not return calls. This was not avoidance. It was flight. From that moment on, the case changed permanently. John was no longer just a suspect in a long unsolved homicide. He was a fugitive. Warrants followed. Alerts were issued. The search expanded beyond state lines. Investigators now worked two cases at once: proving the murder and finding the man who believed he could outrun it. The long shadow that began in 2016 was finally moving. And it was moving fast.
By early 2023, John Blauvelt was gone, but the case no longer depended on his presence. His disappearance did not weaken the investigation, it strengthened it. Flight is not proof of guilt, but it is behavior. And behavior, in this case, aligned perfectly with the evidence investigators had spent years assembling. The man who once cooperated had now chosen absence over explanation. Prosecutors began building the case without him. Every element was re-examined under courtroom standards. Timelines were tightened to the minute. Phone records traced movements across days and locations. Deleted messages were recovered and contextualized. Financial activity, travel patterns, and behavioral shifts were placed into a single, continuous narrative. At the center of it all remained October 2016. Investigators reconstructed the final hours of Katie Feldman's life, not as speculation, but as sequence. Where she was, who she spoke to, when communications stopped, what followed immediately after. John's statements from 2016 were compared against data recovered years later. The contradictions were no longer subtle. Locations he denied, movements he minimized, gaps that could no longer be explained away as faulty memory. Charles Scott's role was formally addressed. Evidence showed he had contact with John before and after Katie's disappearance. Location data placed him nearby, but proximity alone was not enough. After extensive review, prosecutors concluded that Charles did not participate in the killing itself. His actions pointed instead toward poor judgment, delayed reporting, and post-event concealment, not planning or execution. Hannah Thompson's involvement, however, followed a clearer trajectory. She was present in the aftermath. She assisted in practical ways: transportation, silence. Individually, each act could be minimized. Together, they formed a pattern of intentional assistance after the crime. Not murder, but protection of the murderer. Without John in custody, the prosecution strategy was precise. There would be no emotional appeals, no speculation, only structure. The case was presented as it was lived, slowly, deliberately, and methodically. A crime committed in private, hidden by manipulation, and sustained by silence. A suspect who stayed free for years, then ran when the structure closed in. By mid-2023, indictments were finalized. John Blauvelt was formally charged with first-degree murder.
Hannah Thompson faced charges as an accessory after the fact. Charles Scott was charged in connection with obstruction and concealment. The courtroom remained empty of the central figure, but his absence spoke loudly. Every motion, every filing, every warrant reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a crime of impulse. It was sustained by control, planning, and calculated decisions long after the act itself. The case was ready. All that remained was to find the man who believed distance could protect him.
John Blauvelt did not disappear into chaos. He disappeared into planning. After leaving South Carolina, he moved west, methodically, quietly, avoiding patterns. He changed names. He avoided long stays. He worked under the radar. To the outside world, he was no longer John Blauvelt. He was Ben Clean. In Oregon, he attempted to rebuild what he believed could be a separate life. New routines, new locations, no connections to his past. He didn't run recklessly. He hid patiently, trusting distance more than speed. But fugitives rarely escape data. Years after Katie Feldman's murder, the investigation never stopped. Digital footprints were revisited, tips were reanalyzed, old leads were rechecked with new tools, and eventually the alias surfaced, not through chance, but through pattern recognition. Once identified, the end came quietly. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, no resistance. Law enforcement moved in with precision. John was taken into custody without incident. The man who believed he had outpaced time was finally forced to face it. Back in court, the absence was replaced by presence. The prosecution presented a complete narrative, not rushed, not emotional, not speculative. Phone records, location data, forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, testimony from those who had been manipulated or pressured into silence. The picture was clear. Katie Feldman's death was not accidental. It was not spontaneous. It was planned, controlled, followed by calculated concealment. And when exposure became inevitable, it was followed by flight. The verdict reflected that clarity. John Blauvelt was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Hannah Thompson, whose role had never crossed into the act itself, was convicted as an accessory after the fact. Her sentence reflected participation, not authorship. Charles Scott was held accountable for obstruction and concealment, but not for the killing. The case closed without spectacle. No answers brought Katie back. No sentence restored what was taken. But the structure held. The truth stood. And the man who believed he could outrun consequence learned a final, unavoidable fact. Distance can delay justice. It cannot erase it. On the surface, the Knoefel family looked ordinary, quiet, stable, safe. They lived in Willoughby Hills, Ohio, a peaceful suburb just outside Cleveland, a place where neighbors waved, lawns were trimmed, and nothing ever seemed to happen. Their house sat near the Chagrin River, a modest three-bedroom home with a wide front yard. A trampoline stood near the driveway. A wooden playset with a slide hinted at laughter, childhood, routine. This was the kind of home where people believed nothing truly bad could happen. Lisa Knoefel was 41 years old. She worked as a social worker for Cuyahoga County's Department of Children and Family Services, a job that required empathy, patience, and strength. Every day, she dealt with families in crisis, neglect, abuse, broken homes.
And yet, those who knew her said she believed deeply in structure, boundaries, and second chances. Her husband, Kevin Knoefel, was a truck driver. Long hours, long routes. He was often away from home, which made Lisa the emotional center of the household. When Kevin was on the road, she held everything together. They had 3 children under their roof, but this was not a traditional family. 3-year-old Haley was their biological daughter. A cheerful toddler, small, vulnerable, the kind of child who still wandered into her parents' bedroom at night seeking comfort. 13-year-old Megan was Lisa's daughter from a previous marriage. Quiet, observant, old enough to sense tension, young enough to not fully understand it. And then there was Sabrina Zunich, 18 years old, their foster daughter. Sabrina had entered the Knoefel household years earlier, after a childhood marked by instability, violence, and neglect. By the time she arrived, she carried emotional scars most adults never fully recover from. Anger, attachment issues, a desperate need to belong. To the outside world, the arrangement looked like a success story. Sabrina was attending school regularly. She was passing drug tests. She was seeing a counselor. On paper, she was thriving. But inside the house, the balance was fragile. Lisa believed in rules. Sabrina resented them. Lisa believed in structure. Sabrina interpreted it as rejection. Arguments became frequent, voices raised behind closed doors, doors slammed, words said that could not be taken back. Sabrina confided to friends that Lisa made her life miserable, that she felt unwanted, replaced, secondary. What no one outside the home could see was how divided the household had become. Lisa's attention was focused on her daughters, Megan and Haley. Sabrina, feeling pushed aside, gravitated toward Kevin. And Kevin did not push her away. Instead, he listened, he comforted, he positioned himself as the one person who truly understood her. Slowly, subtly, boundaries blurred. What appeared to be support began to shift into something else. Something inappropriate, something secret, something dangerous. But on November 12, 2012, none of that was visible to the outside world. That night began like any other. Kevin was on the road driving his truck. Lisa was home with the children. Haley was put to bed around 10 p.m. Megan retreated to her room shortly after. Sabrina stayed up late, sitting in the office area, working on a British literature assignment, headphones in, music playing. A normal house, a normal night. No alarms, no screams, no warnings, just quiet. And beneath that quiet, a storm that had already been building for months. Shortly after midnight, the house was asleep. Megan was in her bedroom. Haley lay quietly in her bed, unaware of how close danger already was. Lisa had gone to her room, exhausted from the day. Only Sabrina was still awake. She had tried to sleep, but a headache wouldn't let go, the kind of dull, pressing pain that keeps your mind restless. She left her room and walked downstairs toward Lisa and Kevin's bedroom, intending to take medication. What happened next would later be described in fragments, conflicting statements, gaps in memory, silence where answers should have been. Sabrina would claim she remembered nothing after entering the bedroom, but what is known is this. At approximately 1:15 a.m., 13-year-old Megan woke up to sounds that did not belong in a sleeping house. Movement, struggling, a noise that triggered instinct before logic. She left her room and ran toward her mother's bedroom. What she saw stopped time. Her foster sister stood inside the room. Her mother was on the bed, and there was a knife. The attack had already begun. Lisa fought back. The wounds on her body would later tell the story her voice never could. Defensive injuries on her arms and hands. Deep, forceful stab wounds to her head, neck, torso, and limbs. The knife was driven in again and again, not in panic, but in sustained violence. One wound severed her carotid artery. Another twisted deep into her jaw. The blade itself bent under the force. This was not a single moment of rage. It was prolonged, relentless. As the violence unfolded, 3-year-old Haley woke up, confused, terrified. She hid in a closet, alone in the dark, while her world collapsed just feet away. Megan ran outside, shaking, and dialed 911. Her voice on the call was frantic, her words broken, but clear enough. Something terrible was happening inside the house. A patrol officer was dispatched immediately. Willoughby Hills was not a place where calls like this were common. As he pulled into the driveway, Megan stood outside, clutching the phone, begging him to make it stop. The officer moved down the hallway toward the bedroom. He announced himself, ordered Sabrina to come out with her hands up. When she stepped into view, the scene became undeniable. Sabrina was covered in blood. Her hands were trembling, and in her grip, the knife. She was crying, unfocused, barely coherent. Small cuts were visible on her hands and legs, injuries consistent with a violent struggle. Lisa lay on the bed, beyond help. Paramedics would later confirm what was already obvious. The blood loss was catastrophic. Her veins had collapsed. Her heart had stopped. She was pronounced dead at the scene. In a single night, the illusion of normality was gone. A mother was dead. A child had witnessed the unthinkable. Another hid in fear. And the person standing with the weapon was someone the family had tried to save. But the most unsettling question still lingered in the air. Why? In the hours after the murder, the focus was obvious. Sabrina Zunich was covered in blood. She held the knife. She was the one standing in the room. From the outside, the case looked simple. But as investigators began pulling at the threads, the story refused to stay contained. Sabrina's behavior during questioning was erratic. She cried, shut down, contradicted herself. She insisted she had no memory of the attack, that after entering Lisa's bedroom to take medication, everything went blank. Investigators had heard claims like this before. Amnesia can be real. It can also be convenient. But what stood out was not only what Sabrina said, it was what she didn't. She spoke about tension in the house, about feeling unwanted, about believing Lisa wanted her gone. Yet beneath those statements was something else, hesitation whenever Kevin's name surfaced. At the same time, Kevin Knoefel arrived at the police station. His wife had just been murdered, and yet officers noticed something unsettling. He was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Kevin explained that he had worked as an EMT, that he had seen death before, that there was nothing they could tell him that would shock him. What disturbed investigators wasn't composure, it was focus. Kevin repeatedly asked about Sabrina, where she was, how she was doing, when he could see her. He demanded to be placed on her visitors list. Not once did he ask to see his wife's body. Not once did he ask how Megan was coping. His attention stayed locked on Sabrina. Behind closed doors, detectives began reconstructing the family dynamic. What they found was not harmony, it was fracture. Sabrina had come from a childhood steeped in chaos, abuse, addiction, instability. By the time she entered the Knoefel home, she was already deeply vulnerable, desperate for approval, for attachment, for safety. Lisa believed structure and discipline would help. Kevin offered something else: attention, validation, and eventually, secrecy. Friends of Sabrina later described an uncomfortable closeness between them, lingering touches, sexual jokes, conversations that crossed boundaries no foster parent should ever approach. And slowly, a line was crossed. Kevin didn't present himself as a predator, he presented himself as a rescuer. He told Sabrina she was special, that Lisa didn't understand her, that the household was divided because Lisa made it that way. Over time, Kevin positioned himself as Sabrina's only ally. When Lisa and Sabrina argued, Kevin took Sabrina's side. When Sabrina felt rejected, Kevin reinforced it. And when talk of divorce entered the picture, Kevin began planting something far darker. He told Sabrina he wanted to leave Lisa, that they could be together openly, that Lisa was standing in the way of their future. What Sabrina didn't see, or couldn't, was that Kevin was shaping her reality, feeding her resentment, encouraging her anger, and slowly reframing violence as necessity. By September 2012, police had already been called to the house for domestic disputes. Lisa suspected something was wrong. She wasn't imagining it. Kevin confided in friends that Lisa believed he was having an affair with Sabrina. He didn't deny it. Instead, he worried about consequences, custody, money, control. And then there was the insurance. Nearly $800,000 in policies on Lisa's life. To Kevin, the math was simple. Divorce meant loss. Death meant freedom. To Sabrina, the message was more dangerous. Kevin told Sabrina that Lisa was the reason he was suffering, that without Lisa, everything would be better, that if Lisa were gone, they could finally be together. And slowly, the unthinkable stopped sounding impossible. By the time November arrived, the idea had been discussed, revisited, refined. This was no sudden explosion. It was a plan forming in the shadows. And Sabrina, young, unstable, desperate for love, was being guided toward a role she would never escape.
By November of 2012, the Knoefel household was no longer a home. It was a pressure chamber. The arguments between Lisa and Sabrina had become routine. Voices raised behind closed doors, accusations, resentment, and beneath it all, a secret that would define everything that followed. Kevin had already made his choice. In the days leading up to November 12th, the conversations between Kevin and Sabrina turned explicit, direct, deadly. This was no longer emotional venting or fantasy. It was planning. Kevin told Sabrina that divorce was impossible, that Lisa would take everything, that he would lose Haley, that financially, Lisa was worth more dead than alive. Nearly $800,000 in life insurance. Kevin framed the murder as a solution, as an act of love, as something that had to be done. On the night of November 12th, Kevin made sure he was gone. He left for work, creating the perfect alibi. Inside the house, everything was quiet, exactly as planned. Sometime after midnight, Sabrina moved through the house. She entered Lisa's bedroom while she slept. What followed was not quick, and it was not restrained. Lisa woke up and fought. She fought with everything she had. The medical examiner would later document 178 separate stab wounds to the head, the neck, the torso, the arms, the legs, defensive wounds everywhere. The knife was driven deep, twisted, withdrawn, and driven again. One strike severed a major artery in Lisa's jaw. Blood loss was catastrophic. Her veins collapsed. Her heart stopped. This was not panic. This was rage, fueled by manipulation. When it was over, Sabrina stood in the room, covered in blood, holding a knife that had bent from the force of the attack. 3-year-old Haley hid in a closet. Megan would discover the aftermath. And in those final moments, the plan unraveled. Sabrina did exactly what Kevin had told her to do. She said nothing. She claimed she didn't remember. She acted confused. Because Kevin had promised her that insanity would protect her. But crimes like this do not stay buried. And neither do lies. For 9 months, Sabrina Zunick sat in a jail cell, alone with the weight of what she had done. At first, she held the line. She claimed amnesia. She claimed she didn't remember the attack. She followed the script Kevin had given her: an insanity defense, silence, confusion. But reality has a way of breaking through lies. As the weeks turned into months, it became clear that Kevin had not kept his promises. There were no lawyers waiting, no plan to save her, no future together. Sabrina began to understand the truth. She had been used. In August of 2013, Sabrina made a decision that changed the entire case. She went to prosecutors and told them everything about the relationship, the grooming, the manipulation, the planning, the life insurance, the instructions, the lies. Her confession shifted the focus of the investigation. Kevin Knoefel was no longer just a grieving husband, he was a suspect. Investigators reopened every detail of the case. Witnesses came forward. Friends confirmed the inappropriate relationship. Recorded conversations supported Sabrina's claims. The image Kevin had carefully constructed began to collapse. In 2014, Kevin Knoefel was arrested and charged with complicity to commit aggravated murder and multiple counts of sexual battery. Sabrina pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Kevin chose to fight. In court, his defense argued that there was no physical evidence tying him to the murder, that the case relied solely on the testimony of a mentally unstable young woman with a history of trauma and substance abuse. But the jury saw something else. They saw a man who exploited authority, a man who manipulated a vulnerable teenager, a man who turned love into a weapon. On June 11, 2014, Kevin Knoefel was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 30 years, plus additional time for sexual battery, to be served consecutively. 2 lives ended that night. Lisa's, permanently. Sabrina's, slowly, behind bars. And Kevin lost the one thing he thought he had controlled: the narrative.
Lisa Holm was 17 years old. She lived in Skövde, a quiet Swedish town where routines are predictable and distances are short. She was known as reliable, polite, someone who showed up on time and followed through. In the summer of 2015, she worked seasonal shifts at a small cafe in Bloomberg, a rural area surrounded by farmland, workshops, and narrow roads that empty quickly in the evening. Sunday, June 7, 2015, was supposed to be ordinary. Lisa reported to work earlier that day, completing her cafe shift without incident. Customers came and went, conversations were brief. Nothing about the day suggested it would end differently than dozens before it. As the evening approached, staff began closing routines, wiping counters, checking inventory, preparing to lock up. At 6:23 p.m., Lisa sent a text message to her father. She wrote that she was finished with her shift and heading home on her moped. It was a small message, routine, the kind parents receive without thinking twice. Her father expected her to arrive in Skövde later that evening, just as she always did. She never did. When Lisa failed to return home, concern grew steadily. This was not like her. She did not change plans without notice. She did not disappear without explanation. As hours passed, her father decided not to wait any longer. He drove to the cafe in Bloomberg himself. What he found immediately raised alarm. Lisa's moped was parked outside the cafe, exactly where she would normally leave it. The keys were still in the ignition. Her helmet was gone. The cafe owner joined him, and together they searched the building and surrounding area. Storage rooms, nearby paths, the immediate grounds. Lisa was nowhere. At 9:47 p.m., police were contacted, and Lisa Holm was officially reported missing. Officers arrived shortly afterward and began a preliminary search. Dogs were deployed. Nearby outbuildings and a multi-room shed were checked. Nothing was found that night. No sign of struggle, no indication of where Lisa had gone. At that stage, the situation remained ambiguous, but one detail stood out immediately. Lisa had not left voluntarily. Her transportation was still there. Her personal routine had been interrupted mid-motion. Whatever happened occurred quickly, within minutes of her finishing work. Police secured the area and expanded the search radius. The case transitioned from concern to urgency. Rural locations provide cover. Darkness comes fast, and time, already slipping away, was now critical. By the end of the night, one thing was clear. Lisa Holm had vanished between closing her shift and starting her journey home. And someone else had been there.
Lisa Holm did not show up the following morning. The search continued, but with every passing hour, the urgency only intensified. Police began a meticulous examination of the cafe and surrounding areas, inspecting every corner, building, and path Lisa might have taken. Tracking dogs followed scents, but there were almost no traces of the girl. The situation became more complicated with the appearance of odd details. During a search of a nearby barn, a volunteer team discovered a single glove. At first, it seemed insignificant, perhaps someone had left it there earlier, but experienced investigators knew, in missing persons cases, small details rarely occur by chance. Lisa's parents and close friends began recalling details that had seemed trivial before. They described her plans for the evening, how she always removed her jacket before riding her moped, the helmet she always wore. Every tiny fact became part of the bigger picture the investigators were trying to assemble. On the second day after her disappearance, June 8th, the search area expanded. Volunteers from the Swedish organization Missing People, known for their methodical work in locating missing individuals, joined the effort. They combed the entire district, including nearby private properties. There they found Lisa's personal belongings, her phone case, receipts, tickets, and keys. The following day, June 9th, a pair of Lisa's earrings was discovered in the barn. Her moped driver's license and house keys were also found within this area. It was now clear either Lisa had left these items deliberately or someone had placed them there after the fact. The incident began to take on the characteristics of a crime. Investigators started considering that Lisa might be in danger from the moment she vanished. All these elements were forming a grim mosaic: scattered belongings, a missing girl, and no indication that she had left voluntarily. On the third day of the search, June 10th, the barn and surrounding areas were thoroughly inspected again. Missing People volunteers noticed something unusual. 2 individuals arrived claiming they had already searched the area. This raised suspicion. Police revisited the site and, in addition to personal belongings, found Lisa's jacket and helmet. Finally, on Friday, June 12th, Lisa's body was found in one of the nearby barns. She had been strangled. The location and condition of the body indicated a brutal but planned murder. There were no signs of a struggle. It was clear Lisa had been lured from the cafe or otherwise trapped, and her death occurred in a controlled environment. Investigators established several key points. 1. The motive was sexual in nature. 2. The perpetrator deliberately hid the body, attempting to mislead the search. 3. DNA of the suspect was found on Lisa's clothing and on the rope used to strangle her. 4. The suspect had no alibi on the day of her disappearance. The discovery of Lisa's body marked a turning point. What had started as a missing persons case became a fully fledged criminal investigation. Every step, every small detail was now part of a larger, meticulously planned picture. Lisa Holm, a 17-year-old girl who had simply wanted to finish her shift, had become the center of one of Sweden's most widely followed criminal cases. Her death forced investigators to work even more methodically, uncovering all the details and motives of the perpetrator. This case would be studied for years,
and its lessons would remain. By mid-June 2015, the search had ended, but the work had not. Lisa Holm had been found, yet the truth behind her death was still unfolding. Investigators now moved away from the fields and barns and into analysis rooms, evidence labs, and hours of silent review. This phase was slower, quieter, and far more decisive. Every detail from Lisa's final shift was replayed: the closing of the cafe, the empty space where her moped had been left, the short window of time in which she vanished. There was no sign of panic, no broken objects, no witnesses reporting screams. That absence spoke loudly. Whatever happened to Lisa had begun calmly, with conversation, familiarity, or trust. Attention turned to the area surrounding the cafe and nearby properties. One location stood out: a workshop in Martorp, close enough to walk, isolated enough to avoid attention. Investigators had searched it before. Now they returned with a different focus. Inside, forensic specialists found what the initial searches had missed. DNA recovered from a rope and from several of Lisa's personal items pointed to one individual, not a local resident, not a passerby, but a man who worked nearby and had been present in the area during the search itself. Neregis Bilavicius, 35 years old, a factory worker, quiet, largely invisible, until he wasn't. Investigators reviewed his movements during the days following Lisa's disappearance. He had remained unusually close to the search zone. He had spoken with volunteers. He had shown interest in how the search was progressing and where it was headed. At the time, it looked like concern. In retrospect, it looked like monitoring. Digital records confirmed what behavior suggested. His phone activity aligned with critical moments in the timeline. There were no unexplained gaps, no credible explanation for his presence near key locations, and no alibi that held under scrutiny. Forensic analysis established that Lisa had been killed by strangulation. The method was controlled. There was no indication of chaos or resistance. This was not a crime born from impulse. It was contained, deliberate, and executed in a place chosen for privacy. Investigators began to understand the sequence. Lisa had not run. She had not fought in public. She had been intercepted and isolated. By the end of this phase, the investigation had shifted irreversibly. There was no longer a mystery about whether this was a targeted act. The evidence told a different story. Someone had waited. Someone had acted, and someone believed he could disappear back into the background. He was wrong. By late June 2015, the investigation had firmly established Neregis Bilavicius as the prime suspect in Lisa Holm's murder. With the evidence meticulously collected, DNA, personal items, mobile phone records, and witness statements, prosecutors prepared to present a case that would leave little room for doubt. The courtroom was tense. Families, journalists, and the public filled the seats, all waiting for answers about the young girl from Hyo who had vanished so suddenly. Prosecutors began methodically, outlining the timeline: Lisa leaving her workplace, the moment she was intercepted, her movements traced through digital data, and finally the grim discovery of her body in the remote workshop. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's evidence, questioning the reliability of timestamps, the interpretation of forensic data, and even suggesting alternative scenarios. Could someone else have been involved? Could some evidence have been contaminated? But the prosecution had anticipated these defenses, presenting cross-verified timelines and multiple independent confirmations that left no significant gaps. Behavioral experts also testified, explaining Blauvech's psychological profile. They detailed signs of predatory behavior, meticulous planning and control, emphasizing how his actions were deliberate rather than impulsive. His manipulations during the investigation, attempting to redirect volunteers and interfere with searches, further demonstrated calculated intent. Witnesses were called, including colleagues from Lisa's workplace and members of the Missing People volunteer organization, whose discovery of her personal items was pivotal in confirming the suspect's pattern of concealment. Each testimony added weight, painting a clear picture of the methodical and premeditated nature of the crime. After weeks of careful examination of evidence and cross-examinations, the jury deliberated. By mid-2015, the verdict was announced. Nereus Blauvechis was found guilty of murder. The evidence had proven beyond reasonable doubt that his actions were intentional, planned, and executed with cruel precision. The court emphasized the gravity of the crime. A 17-year-old girl taken in broad daylight, murdered by someone she had no reason to fear in a premeditated act driven by obsession and control. Blauvechis received a life sentence, and the trial underscored the importance of detailed investigative work, cross-verified evidence, and careful observation of both physical and behavioral clues. Justice, though delayed by the complexities of the case, had been served. The case would remain a chilling example of calculated predation, demonstrating the lengths investigators must go to ensure accountability and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The verdict was delivered. The court had spoken. But the world outside did not pause. There was no sense of triumph, only exhaustion. Legally, the case had concluded, but its ripples extended far beyond the courtroom. Liza Holm had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol. Across Sweden, her story sparked reflection. Conversations about public safety, workplace vulnerability, and the uncomfortable truth began. Violence does not always emerge from shadows. Sometimes it hides in the ordinary. Cafes, parking lots, workshops, places that once felt safe now carried unease. After the trial, media coverage continued, but the focus had shifted. This was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a lesson in responsibility, in noticing the warning signs that went unseen. Workplace inspections increased. Questions arose about security measures, oversight, and how easily isolated spaces can become traps. The system had not created the crime, but it had failed to prevent it. For Liza's family, the consequences were deeply personal. They withdrew from public attention, choosing silence over scrutiny. No verdict could return what was lost. Justice could be defined in law, but grief cannot. At the cafe where Liza had finished her last shift, memorials appeared, flowers, candles, notes from strangers. For a time, people lingered quietly, standing where a young life had abruptly ended. Eventually, the crowds dispersed, but the memory remained. Years later, Liza Holm's case continued to be referenced in discussions of criminal behavior, victim protection, and public awareness, not just for its brutality, but for how swiftly an ordinary day can turn into tragedy. One conversation, one decision, one moment from which there is no return. The man responsible remained behind bars, removed from society. Yet imprisonment offered little comfort. Punishment does not undo loss. Only lessons endure. Danger does not always announce itself. Control can be invisible. Violence often disguises itself as normality, and the line between safety and tragedy is thinner than it seems. Liza Holmes' story did not end with a verdict. It ended with a warning.
Out of all these cases, which ones stayed with you the most? Thank you to everyone who watched the video all the way to the end. Our team put a lot of effort into creating it. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. It's a huge motivation for us to work even harder and release new videos faster.